Welcome to Community Life Church. We desire to help you belong, be known, and find purpose through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're so glad that you're listening to our podcast today. Whatever platform you're on, hit the subscribe or follow button to get notified each week when a new message is released. You can learn more about Community Life Church at communitylifepeoria.church. Now let's jump into our message today.
This text today starts off in verse 1, and it says, "And David said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Do you see what's happening here is that David is aiming to extend kindness, extend grace to a member of the household of Saul because of the actions of Jonathan. And that is crazy. It's crazy when you consider the fact that Saul tried to kill David. Yet, David wants to honor the household of Saul because of Jonathan. Even though Saul, at one point, in the crazy conflict between David and Saul, at one point, David was betrothed to Saul's daughter, and Saul gave that daughter to another man. Yet David wants to honor the household of Saul. Saul had David oppressed for many years, on the run, hiding in caves. Yet David wants to honor the household of Saul. In fact, anyone in the household of Saul could have claim on the throne and be a threat to David. Yet David aims to extend kindness to the household of Saul. Let me ask you this. Have you ever stopped to think about how crazy the idea of Christian grace really is? It's absolutely crazy. Not only do we receive grace from God that we don't deserve, but then we are called to give away grace because of what God has done in our lives. If you were to really think about it, the Christian lifestyle doesn't make any sense except for the fact that Jesus died in my place for my sins. The fact that we were to be generous and to love one another and to pour ourselves out for each other and sacrifice. None of those things make sense except for the fact that Jesus died in my place for my sins. And it's because of the love and the faithfulness of Jesus that we are called to live differently. That thing that we're called to, this idea that because of Jesus Christ we get to live differently, is found in the covenant of grace. Covenantal grace. And what David shows us is how covenant grace is to work in our own lives. See, because we really like this idea of grace. We love it. The idea that we can stand before God as though we've never sinned, that's wonderful. We love that gift. But grace is fine until it starts to cost us something, until it starts to cost us more than we thought, until it's uncomfortable for us. All of a sudden then, covenantal grace doesn't seem so great. But today I want us to see how covenantal grace plays a huge role in our lives. Let's look at verses 1 through 5 for a second. So David asked the question, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? It said, now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? He said, I am your servant. The king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show kindness to God, the kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. How great! Not only does he aim to bless the household of Saul, but it's actually the son of Jonathan, his best friend. But it says here, he is crippled in his feet. The king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amel at Lodebar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amel, to Lodebar. Here's the first thing I want us to see about covenantal grace, is that covenant grace seeks. Covenant grace seeks. I imagine when this story takes place that David was musing about his life, just kind of thinking about his life, reflecting on some of the things that he had been through, been reflecting on the grace and the goodness of God when he remembers Jonathan. He just remembers his friend Jonathan and the love and affection that Jonathan had for him, the commitment that Jonathan had to David, even though Jonathan was to be the heir to the throne of Israel. Yet Jonathan loved David. And as he's thinking about Jonathan, I imagine it causes him to remember their covenant. See, David and Jonathan had a covenant that David would honor Jonathan. So what David aims to do here is he aims to honor Jonathan with his own actions. The thing that I think is interesting is that David then is going to extend grace. But David doesn't wait for there to be an offense of the household of Saul for him to extend grace. David is wading out into deep waters to extend grace before an offense is even given. See, in David's effort to be a gracious person, he seeks an opportunity to extend God's grace. I think it's really powerful that he says, there's someone left in the household of Saul that I can show kindness of God to him. Do you know it's the same way with Jesus? That Jesus isn't waiting for you to sin in order for him to extend grace. In fact, in Luke 19:10, it says, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. When you weren't looking for Jesus, Jesus was looking for you. When you were still running around in your sins, Jesus was seeking you out. See, this covenantal grace is not meant to be a passive thing or even a reactionary thing. This kind of grace, the grace that we're talking about, is a proactive thing that is to be actively at work in us. So here's the thing, the call on a Christian's life to be gracious to others doesn't start the moment someone sins against you. In fact, we aim to do the very same thing that David does, is that we want to show honor to somebody else because of the actions of Jesus. Because Jesus died in my place for my sins, I aim to be gracious. But if you desire to be a gracious person, as we should, that starts by seeking to be gracious long before the offense ever comes. So that when the offense does come, you already have preemptive grace ready for it. You're already prepared to extend grace because you have already been musing on the fact that you get grace from God that you do not deserve. So the first thing that we need to see is that graciousness, this covenant grace, seeks out, that it is the moving factor. It's not reactionary, it's proactive. So then look what happens next in verse 6. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth! There's an exclamation point there, y'all. You got to get excited. Mephibosheth! And he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear. I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Do you see what's happening? Mephibosheth, who's lame in feet, meaning he can't even stand on his own, ends up falling down on his knees before the king, terrified. And David has this beautiful encounter, and he ends it with him saying, why would you have regard for a dead dog like me? See, the second aspect of covenant grace is that covenant grace brings peace. Covenant grace brings peace. Mephibosheth expects judgment. Why? Well, because he's in the line of Saul. Mephibosheth is afraid because he has inherited guilt from Saul. If you think about it, if you've watched any movie or show about kings, you know kings will do anything to protect their throne. And lineage passes down through the patriarchy that if a king dies, then his son is to be the next king. And if not him, then his next son, so on and so forth. So there is a way where we could see that Mephibosheth is to be the next king of Israel. Mephibosheth isn't trying to get the throne. But when he gets called before the king, you can imagine that he's totally afraid that he's going to be killed. He feels unworthy to be there, one, because of his physical status. To be a crippled at that time was to be a burden on society, to be outcasted and pushed away. So he feels unworthy to be there simply because of his physical status, and he knows that he stands to be punished because of his family status. Simply because of the fact that he is in the lineage of Saul, he could be killed. In fact, even in biblical times, David would have been justified to kill Mephibosheth right there in an effort to bring peace and security to himself and his right to the throne. But the beautiful thing here is that isn't what David aimed to do. David isn't aiming to protect himself. David isn't aiming to protect his right to the throne. David isn't aiming to protect his rightness. This is David taking the peace that he has already received from God, the peace that he has, and knowing that he's doing exactly what God has called him to do, and seeking to extend that peace to the life of another. Here's the powerful thing that happens. Not only does covenantal grace seek out people, but because of covenantal grace, the offended moves towards the offender. David could have been hostile to Mephibosheth. In fact, by a lot of his advisors' sake, they probably would have said, you should absolutely be hostile to this family that has so egregiously offended you. But that's not what David does. Because of covenantal grace, and because of the life of Jonathan that David seeks to honor, the offended move towards the offender. And he's only able to do that, I think, because David identifies with Mephibosheth. I think a part of David resonates with Mephibosheth. One of the things that David tells him is that because of the actions of your father, I'm going to extend you a grace. And when we talk about that word grace, you know the word means gift. The actual word grace means gift. It is a gift of God for us to be forgiven. It's a gift of God for us to be called children of God. I'll tell you a story about the word grace. In 2018, we adopted our first daughter, Briella. And it was wonderful. And we went through the agency. We got partnered with a birth mom. We got to pick her up, and we adopted her. She was our daughter. We said, that was great. Let's do it again. So we enter the adoption process. And then right in the middle of that, a global-wide pandemic happens. And so we end up waiting almost 2 years before we get a call from the agency. And the way that call works is they call me and they say, hey, Matthew, a baby was born on Friday. This is a Sunday. Hey, a baby was born on Friday. Birth mom has chosen you. Do you want this baby? And we're like, yeah, we want that baby. They said, great. Baby's got to be discharged in an hour and a half. Can you get here? I said, sure. Where is the baby located? Oh, Scottsdale Osborne, which is a 45-minute drive from you. I said, great. Now keep in mind, we had been waiting 2 years for this baby, so we didn't have the car seat ready to go. We didn't have all the diapers and the formula. So what do? Trace and I go to Target. She goes down one aisle, I go down the other, and it was like a shopping spree, just like. We got there in time. We did get there in time. What does that have to do with grace, Matthew? Well, the moment that we got off the phone with the agency, I remember falling to my knees with tears in my eyes, and I said, this is a gift from the Lord. And so we said we were going to honor that by putting grace in the middle of her name. So her name is Emerlyn Grace Mueller, because she is a gift of the Lord to us. And see, what David is doing here is he's going to extend a grace, extend a gift to Mephibosheth, not because Mephibosheth deserves it. David didn't even know that Mephibosheth existed. But he wants to give him a gift because of what Jonathan has done for him. Why is David able to do this? Like I said, I think in part it's because David sees himself in Mephibosheth. If I can remind you all the way back to a sermon that Noah preached a few weeks ago, when Saul is hunting down David, David says this to him in 1 Samuel 24. He says, after whom has the king of Israel come out? And after whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? I think it's remarkable that David refers to himself as a dead dog. King, why are you coming after me like I'm a dead dog? And now Mephibosheth is saying, who am I that you would show honor to a dead dog such as I? I think David remembers that feeling. I bet David was able to identify with Mephibosheth and say to himself, I know what it's like to be him, because I've been the same kind of broken that he is. Now, just because David aims to bring peace to Mephibosheth's life doesn't mean that everything that's happened to David at the hand of Saul was okay. The very fact that David wants to honor somebody in the household of Saul doesn't negate the fact that all the things that Saul did to him were absolutely awful. David's not saying that there wasn't this giant conflict between him and Saul. But what he is saying is, I refuse to get even. I refuse to make the household of Saul pay for what they did to me. In fact, David decides to cover the gap. You ever heard that phrase before? He decides to cover the gap. What I mean by that is anytime there is an expectation that is different from the reality, there's a gap that's created. Happens all the time. It happens in conflicts with just people. Maybe you had an expectation of a friend. They failed to meet that expectation. And now there's this gap. Happens in our marriages, all over the place. And what we're forced to do is we have to fill that gap in with something. It's easy for us to fill that gap full of suspicion and go, well, they just wanted me to fail. Or they just not the kind of friend I thought. Or they don't appreciate me. We can fill that gap with all sort of things. Or we can take David's approach and we can fill that gap with grace. David chooses to fill the gap between what should have happened and what actually happened in his honoring of Saul with grace. He fills it with grace. Because those who have received grace that they cannot deserve, that they do not deserve, can give grace when it isn't deserved. If you can really reconcile in your mind that God has given you grace that you do not deserve, you should be of the most willing to give grace to others even when they don't deserve it. Verse 9 says this, Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. The third thing I want you to see today is that covenant grace restores what was lost. Covenant grace restores what was lost. David aims to give back everything that was once Saul's. But if you think about it, how much does the king own? How much does a king possess when he's king? If you were just to look at England for just a second, at the royal family, the amount of properties that they own, the amount of acres that they own is vast. It is huge. They have great wealth. You can imagine that Saul had a lot of the same things. But David has taken possession of those. But now David goes, no, I'm going to give it back to Mephibosheth. But not only that, recognizing that Mephibosheth is lame in his feet, he can't work the land, David goes, oh yeah, servants, you're going to take care of that land. You're going to harvest the food. You're going to put food on his table. And as the king, he says, I'm going to make that happen for this family. That comes out of a lot of cost to David and the kingdom. It reminds me of a story that Jesus tells in the New Testament when he talks about what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says this, Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wishes to settle his accounts with his servants. So there's a king who wants to get paid back for all the money that he is due. Verse 24 says, When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And for the sake of conversions, that's like $1 bajillion. And since he could not pay, because nobody could pay that kind of money, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him that debt. I want you to think about something for that king in that parable. That king had to at some point tally the cost of how much was owed. And it says it was 10,000 talents, $1 bajillion. And for the king to cancel that debt means that the kingdom is out $1 gajillion. It means the king paid for it. The king said, I will pay that debt. The kingdom will pay that debt. To cancel the debt is to disadvantage the king's own kingdom. That's the very same thing that's happening to David. David is choosing to cut off some of the kingdom's assets to restore it back to Mephibosheth. See, the one who is offering the restoration is the one who covers the gap. That's the thing about covenant grace, is that the one who's seeking to be gracious, the one who's seeking restoration, is the one who covers the gap. See, David is disadvantaging himself because of this covenantal grace. See, restoration doesn't just mean that they no longer have to pay because the debt is canceled. It also means that their position is as if they never had sinned before, as if they had never had any offense before. Simply put, forgiveness and restoration isn't just you don't have to pay anymore, but you are welcome here. Restoration and forgiveness is that you belong here. You're allowed here. We're happy to have you here. As if they were never offended in the first place. Covenantal grace allows someone to, what the offended gets to say to the offender is, you no longer have to hang your head in guilt and shame. You no longer have to wait for me to demand payment from you for the wrong things that you've done. Covenantal grace says you are welcome here and you do not have to pay. But let me just pause the sermon. Can we pause the sermon for a second? Disclaimer here. There are situations in which I don't think that you should say, hey, you are forgiven. You don't have to hang your head in shame anymore, and you are welcome back. There's a real thing called domestic violence where people abuse other people. And let me just tell you, you can forgive someone, you can have them restored by God, and you can still call the police. That's a really important disclaimer for me to tell you. Not every offense deserves that we should be in relationship together. But in every situation, we can seek forgiveness and restoration. Not that we have to be reconciled. We good on that? Unpause. Welcome back. See, what covenant grace does in our hearts as we seek to be gracious and as we seek to give peace away is it lets us let go of our need to get even. David just goes, I don't need to get even with the household of Saul. In fact, I can bless Saul because God has so richly blessed me. So it goes on to say in the second part of verse 10, it says, but Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. So David says, hey, all you servants, you're going to deal with the crops. You're going to bring in all the food. You're going to do all that work so that there's always bread on your master's table. But hear this, your master, he's never going to eat there. He's going to eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord, the king commands his servant, so you will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. The last thing I want you to see from this text about covenant grace is that covenant grace gives what could not be earned. Covenant grace gives what could not be earned. David tells Mephibosheth, not only am I going to restore everything to you, but you're going to eat at my table. And not like you're going to eat at my table down on the far end, like you get the guest seat. No, it says like he was one of his own sons. This isn't just like, hey, you're always welcome for dinner. Have you ever told somebody that, hey, y'all stop by anytime? You don't mean that. You don't mean for them to stop by anytime. What you mean is, please call before you come over. And we'll see if there's enough for you. That's not this. This isn't you're always welcome. This is you are always expected at our table. Well, who's expected at a dinner table? Family. I bet many of you, when you're planning dinner tonight, are not expecting Tracy and I and our 3 kids to show up. Why? Well, because we're not family. You expect your family to be at the table. And it's like David is saying to Mephibosheth, you will function like you were a member of my family. And you will be blessed. You know, it makes a point in the text to remind us that Mephibosheth was lame in both his feet. And I think it does this as a reminder that Mephibosheth couldn't have earned this. He has nothing to offer David. He can't serve David. Until David had restored everything, he had no finances to pay David. He had nothing of value to David. Yet, the king does this anyway. It reminds us that he couldn't have earned this. It was just given to him. But see, that's the power of covenantal grace. And it's in this grace and this story that we see here in David that we too can give forgiveness and grace away. We can do it the exact same way. You know, throughout this entire Man After God's Own Heart sermon series, we've given you a case study. Well, I want to give you a case study on how to forgive based off what we see in this text today, how to extend grace. So here it is. The first thing you have to do is you have to tally the cost. If you go back to that parable that Jesus told, he knew exactly how much that servant owed him. 10,000 talents, $1 bazillion. Before you can aim to extend grace, before you can aim to have forgiveness, you're going to have to count the cost of how much did that offense cost me. Don't minimize the sin that was done to you. Don't do that because that cheapens the grace. Tally the cost. What was the pain? What was the sin? What was the brokenness that you had to experience? Then the second thing you have to do, like we saw David do with Mephibosheth, you need to identify with your offender. This could be of the hardest things for us to do when we want to offer forgiveness. Because you might go, oh, I don't want to identify with them. I'm nothing like them. I'm nothing like the people who did this to me. I'd say, well, you may not have ever done the things that they've done. And by the grace of God, hopefully you never do. But the thing that you are in common with them with is that you're the same kind of broken they are and in desperate need of a Savior, just like they are. Sinful beyond comparison. So tally the cost. Identify and go, that is just brokenness I see in them, the same brokenness that resides in me. The third step then is to cancel the debt. Like David, like Jesus told us in the parable, refuse to make them pay, saying, you no longer owe me anything. You don't have to try to earn your way back into my good graces. You don't have to try to earn your way back into friendship or whatever the relationship is. Just refuse to make them pay. You no longer owe me anything. And then the fourth step is to let them go. Let them go. Release from your heart the need that they should stand guilty before you. Let them go. That's what David did. He lets him go. In fact, he invites him into his family. Community Life Church, I want so badly for you to grab a hold of this covenant grace. And I want you to be able to use it. But if you were going to be able to use the covenant grace that we see here in this text, it would take you having to identify with the man in this story. You would have to be just like the man in this story. I'm not talking about being like Jonathan, who lived his life worthy of showing honor. I'm not even talking about David, the person who gets to give away this covenantal grace. Community Life Church, the person that you need to be most like in this story, if you're going to be able to understand and use covenant grace, is Mephibosheth. I want you to identify with Mephibosheth. You need to be like Mephibosheth before God. You need to recognize that you are guilty of both offense to the kingdom because of our sins and guilty of inherited sin, that you were just naturally born broken. Like Mephibosheth, you need to be unable to even stand before the king, but instead fall down on your faces lame, not in physical standing, but in spiritual standing. Recognizing that we are nothing but a dead dog before God. And if you can do that, if you can humble yourself to be like Mephibosheth before God, you can experience covenant grace in a way that transforms your life. See, if you do just that and humble yourself and fall on your knees before the Lord, recognizing you have nothing to offer but hoping that the king can show mercy to you, if you can do that, God responds by giving you this covenantal grace. Not because of your actions, but because of the actions of another, Jesus. See, it's an honor to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection and his actions that God will extend grace to you even when you don't deserve it. And the beauty of this is if we can identify with Mephibosheth, then everything that was true for him becomes true for us. Look at it with me. If we can seek the Lord in that, then God's grace is seeking you out. That God's grace seeks you out now. You need to recognize that Jesus came seeking you, that you might be reconciled to him. Because naturally, we won't naturally come to Jesus, so Jesus is the one seeking us out. There's that famous verse that says Jesus leaves the 99 to seek out the one that was lost. Secondly, God's grace brings you peace. In our lives, sin and brokenness can only bring chaos, but God's desire is that you would have peace. And man, when you can find yourself on your knees before the Lord, receiving this grace you do not deserve for the first time in your life, you can taste peace. That you don't have to wait for judgment to fall on you. You don't have to prove yourself to anything, but you can just be forgiven. But thirdly, just like Mephibosheth, God's grace restores you. All that you had lost because of sin, all that brokenness that you've piled on in your life, even your standing before God, your innocence, your righteousness, your identity, all that was taken from you because of sin, God gives back to you. It reminds me of my favorite verses in the Bible in Colossians 1 where he says, "And you who were once alienated," meaning you do not belong, "you who were once alienated, hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy, blameless, and above reproach." It means all that you lost, God gives back to you. Because of God's grace, you get to stand before God as though you never sinned. And then lastly, God's grace gives you what you do not deserve. More than just forgiveness of God, God's grace gives you something more. John 1:12 says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." See, the same thing that David gives Mephibosheth is what God gives us. He gives us a seat at his table as if you were his child. All the days of eternity, you will have a seat at the king's table. I told you that story about my daughter Emerlyn and how we called her Emerlyn Grace. But let me tell you, the best thing about adoption, the best thing that happens is on adoption day when you get to stand before a judge and the judge smacks a gavel and says that you, Matthew and Tracy Mueller, are bestowed with all the right, responsibility, and privilege of being the parents to Emerlyn Grace Mueller. It's a powerful day. But if you think about it for just a second, what did Emerlyn do to earn all the work that we went through to adopt her? Nothing. What did she offer us in return? Are we hoping that she's going to strike it rich, become an NFL player, and make us millions? She's 4 years old and still 27 pounds. I don't think so. There was not some potential promise that she's offered us, so we adopted her. No, she offers us nothing. And in the same way, what can Emerlyn ever do for us to revoke her standing in our family? Nothing. She is and will always be my daughter. That's what God gives us. Not because you could offer him something, not because you could earn it, but because he loves you just that much. So all the days of eternity, you have a seat at the king's table like you were a child of God. Not because you've earned it, but because of the actions of Jesus Christ, who tallied the cost. He knew exactly how much sin there was. He identified with his offenders, and he became in the form of man and suffered everything that we should suffer on our behalf. And then on the cross, he canceled the debt, taking on the full wrath of God. It's there on the cross that Jesus says, "It is finished," meaning the debt has been paid. It's been canceled once and for all. And he lets us go. He doesn't make us pay and gives us what we don't deserve. If I could put all that into a verse, it'd go like this. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says this, "For our sake," not because Jesus needed something, not because God needed something, but for our sake, God made him to be sin, to take on all of our sin. So for our sake, God made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That is covenantal grace. This is the covenant that we get to be a part of when we put our faith in Jesus Christ. That we didn't earn it, we don't deserve it, but we thank Him for it. So church, can you humble yourself to be like Mephibosheth, lame and undeserving? Then can you take that grace that you've been given and can you give it away to others? Not because they deserve it, but because of what Jesus has done for you. See, the wonder of covenantal grace is not merely that a king would forgive its rebels, but rather that a king would welcome those rebels home. That's our story. Let's pray.